So, today we're going to get a whole new sense of what life really is. We all walk around holding a perception of what life is, and that perception often molds our experience and shapes our experience. There's a wonderful quote I like to think about that's in a remarkable book I'm going to talk to you about today called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. When this book was originally written, it was called The Science of Life, and it evolved into Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, and that's really what it's all about. It's how to see things in a scientific, logical way that brings health, and that logical way is a look at how Jesus perceived life. And to understand how Jesus perceived life, we need to kind of unlock the inspiration that's in the Bible, and that Key to the Scriptures does that very thing. And in this book, there's a wonderful little definition I like about changing our perspective on things, and how a change in perspective can bring out harmony. It says, "Our false views of life hide eternal harmony and produce the ills of which we complain." Our false views of life hide eternal harmony and produce the ills of which we complain. Wow. Well, if that's true, if it's a false view that brings out the ills in which we complain, maybe it's a right view that brings out the health that we can all celebrate. In fact, this is what the lecture is all about. It's about the right view of life that can bring us a sense of harmony because this right view is actually true. I'm going to talk about a more heavenly view of life. Sometimes when people talk about heaven, it's very abstract and people think it's kind of the opposite of their reality. But I want to talk about the heavenly consciousness, the heavenly truth that Jesus had really is not only right, but it is obtainable by each of us, and it's the most natural, substantive, concrete thing in the world. You know, if you think about it, a lot of people have had intuitions about life that history showed were just incorrect. A lot of base assumptions about life. Because normally what we assume about life is informed by the physical senses. For a good deal of human history, people believe that we just lived on a flat earth because they would go out to the beach and that's what they would see, a flat earth, a flat horizon line. And yet we know that it's the exact opposite now, don't we? It's not a flat earth that we live on. It's actually a spheroid that we live on. The earth is a sphere. And how do we know that? Well, first you could say that there were just people who had intuitions that there's more than meets the eye, that life is not just what the physical senses present to us from our little earthly or myopic point of view. And then brave explorers, lion-hearted men jumped in boats, traveled all the way around the world, came back to the same spot and said, "Hey, I got a testimony to tell," but not everybody believed them. And then in recent history, astronauts have been able to go way up into outer space, way away from the Earth, you could say up to this heavenly perspective, and actually look down upon the Earth and see this. And you would never look down upon the Earth in that point of view and say, "Oh, the Earth looks ugly today." It's always beautiful from that point of view. And I think Jesus, right where he saw life fallen flat with sin and sickness and discontinuity and death, I think he lifted up his thought to heaven, so to speak, to this divine point of view that I'm going to be talking about. And he saw wholeness. He saw beauty. He saw completeness. Right where the physical senses were showing the opposite. Again, the physical senses often lie to us. They often show us the exact opposite of what's really going on. Every day we talk about a sunrise. You can look at charts online. When's the sun going to rise today? Every day we talk about a sunset. And the same is true. You could look at, okay, what's the timetable today? When is the sun going to set today? We talk about this as it's something that's happening. But the sun is not rising and it's not setting. I mean, before people knew anything about astronomy, they probably thought it was a new sun every day, or the sun is being born and it's growing up to maturity, and then it's decaying, and oh, that's gone, it died. And then they wait, oh, there's a rebirth, it's here again. But now that we know, not only is the Earth flat, it's a spheroid, but not only is the sun not revolving around the Earth is revolving around the sun. Exact opposite, in which the way the physical senses seem to present it to us. It's the exact opposite of that. And, I think the way that Jesus was viewing life from a purely spiritual standpoint, it was the exact opposite of the way that most of his peers were seeing it. And I think this is still true today. We live in a very materialistic culture. And even though I think spirituality has brought a lot of joy and peace and fulfillment to individual lives, most people are still kind of stuck in a paradigm of life being material. But we're going to take a look at what happens when we see life as a purely spiritual phenomenon, in the way that I think Jesus saw it. What happens when we see life out from the sun, so to speak? If we were able to stand on the sun and look out from the sun, we would see things from the correct point of view. We would see that the Earth orbits the sun. Everything is in the orbit of the sun in our galaxy. And we would see that the sun never rises, it never sets, it's always just shining, and shining brand new every moment. Some people, when they think of their spiritual lives, it seems like, maybe there was a point where they were reborn, or where they had some spiritual awakening, and it was like a sunrise in their life. And then they maybe felt like they were growing spiritually, and sometimes felt like there were clouds in their life, and they couldn't see God at all. And some people have felt like, those days have passed, and kind of God has set in my life. But just like if you were standing on the sun, you would realize not only is the sun shining brand new every moment, but everything is in its orbit in our galaxy. I think from this perspective we're going to look at today, God is always shining on each of us. God is the center, the source of our very being, life itself. So let me talk a bit about what I think about when I think about God, because God is just another one of those terms that for many people seems esoteric. It seems like, it's the most important word of all, but it doesn't always seem to be tangible in my everyday life. Well, I think about God as life itself, not an individual life. When we usually talk about life, we talk about it in terms of multiplicity. I have a little life, you've got a little life, maybe there's some animal life over there, plant life. And we think about it as these different little individual life forms, we call them. But if we just lift ourselves up, just look at things from a bigger standpoint for a moment, we're all in life, aren't we? We're all of the same life. There's something bigger than us that's actually creating and sustaining reality. Can't we recognize that? And every day we don't create our own lives. In fact, we don't create anything. We're not really creators. We generally think that our lives are self-made, but when we take a step back, we really begin to recognize that everything about our existence is made by something bigger than ourselves, bigger than an individual psyche or mind. And so I think it's easy to recognize we're all in and of the same life. Well, I think of life as God. Now, what about moments when we've really felt close to life, we've felt at one with life? Those are moments I bet we would describe as love. What is love? It's the unity of being. It's a feeling, a sense of home, of belonging, a dissolution of just an individual in isolation. But it's a feeling of belonging to life, a oneness with life, feeling at home, feeling a part of the family of life. And to think about moments when you've really felt that something was right. That word right is really beautiful. We often use it in everyday language. If we have a day where everything seems to be syncing up and everything's working together for good, we say, everything's going right. And if we observe an accident or someone gets ill suddenly, we'll say, that went wrong. Something went wrong for them. Something went wrong in their life. And I don't think we understand the depth of what we're actually saying in those moments. If you were to do some math and you put 2 plus 2 equals 4 on a chalkboard, and then next to it you put 2 plus 2 equals 5, you could see both of those equations with the same amount of apparent substance to our physical senses. They would seem to have the same weight. And yet one is right because it expresses the principle of mathematics, and one is wrong because it doesn't express that principle. And in our everyday lives, we seem to experience things that are good and experience things that are bad, moments that are right, moments that are wrong. And yet, I think those moments that are wrong are literally wrong. Like they're not substantial because they're not expressing the principle that I would say is God. The word principle comes from the same derivative as the word prime does, meaning something that's irreducible. It can't be explained in terms of anything else. And so I think the principle of life, that which is fundamental or eternal, is God. And I think it's easy to say that there are eternal things about existence. Because if you just take those numbers, 2 plus 2 equals 4, who created those numbers? I didn't create them. You didn't create them. But they're ideas. We could write them down in Roman numerals or digits, or we could write them in different languages. We'd have different words for those equations. But those equations and those numbers are not actually physical things. They're ideas. And every number in the number system is absolutely needed. If you just plucked 4 out of reality, not the material representation of 4, but the actual idea of it, every banking system in the world would just collapse, much worse than any virus could cause. And in fact, this video feed would just stop instantly. Computers around the world would just stop if the idea of number 4 was plucked out of reality. Maybe some of our brothers and sisters would go missing. I mean, all sorts of terrible things would happen. That number is absolutely needed. And it's an idea, but since none of us created that idea as individual minds, there must be something eternal that did, an eternal mind or God. And so I think of God as life, as mind, as love. When Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free," I think that which is true, it's not changeable, it's fundamental or eternal. That's God. So truth is another word for God. In fact, I want to talk today about what's called the Christian Science perspective. And in the Christian Science perspective, there are lots of different words that are used for God to help flesh out, to help give us a deeper and fuller sense of what we're talking about when we refer to deity. And in Science and Health, it says the following. It says, God is incorporeal, divine, supreme, infinite mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, and love. And those last 7 words are really referring to God from different angles. Spirit, it's the opposite of matter. If we talk about the spirit of something, we're talking about the real essence of it, not confined to time or space. And soul, another word for God, the source of all beauty and creativity. Sometimes people talk about God as the creator. And so we're all creative as the expressions of God, but there is one creator that we're a manifestation of. Okay, so I want to share with you an example here right up front of how when this heavenly view comes to light in our present experience, right where something appears to be wrong or discordant or fallen flat, this higher, more heavenly view, this heavenly consciousness, can bring out healing and can often bring it out in the most wonderful, effective ways. Well, all around the world, people are dealing with contagion right now. They're thinking about the ill effects of contagious conditions. And what's interesting is I think since consciousness is fundamental to life, we've never had any experience, any time in our life that was outside of consciousness. I think it's important to understand the mental nature of contagion. Mary Baker Eddy, the author of Science and Health, once said, "Whatever man sees, feels, or in any way takes cognizance of must be caught through mind, inasmuch as perception, sensation, and consciousness belong to mind and not to matter. And if you think of it, perception, sensation, consciousness, these all have to do with mind. We've never had a sensation outside of conscious experience. We've never had when we think of matter itself, in fact, it's a concept we're holding within consciousness. It's an idea that life is out there in form or embodied with limitations. And what's interesting is that in every theory of life, you need to have what's called a first principle. I think it's reasonable to take life or mind or truth as fundamental, God as a fundamental, the fundamental first principle of life. But if you believe in the theory of materialism, that life is made up of stuff out there, little pieces of matter, then at first it just seems confusing because those pieces of matter are within something, right? They have to be within life, so there has to be something bigger than that. But anyhow, if you just take the theory of materialism at face value and say, okay, well, if things are just made up of stuff, what is that stuff? And according to the theory of materialism, we are just physical bodies. We don't have a body, we are a body. And if we are physical bodies, then what are those physical bodies made up of? Organ systems. What are organ systems made up of? Organs. What are organs made up of? Cells. What are cells made up of? You go down the line. Eventually you get down to the atom. And when physicists first found the atom, I think they thought they found the building block of life. That, wow, everything is created of atoms. This is the base thing, this atom. And yet when they looked inside the atom, you know what they saw? That it was 99.9999, many nines, empty space. In biblical language, you could say, Adam, where art thou? If you didn't catch that joke, the very first chapter of Genesis says that each and every one of us are made in the image and likeness of God. That's the very first thing that the Bible says about us. And in fact, that's the first book, the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, Genesis. And it's a beautiful poem. And it represents the right concept of life. Everything comes from one creator, one spirit, one God, one source. And it's fundamentally good. It's fundamentally right. And then there's a second chapter of Genesis where it says, then a mist comes up from the ground. And what does a mist do? It obscures things. You can't really see what's going on from that misty perspective. And from that misty perspective, all of a sudden you start to see this kind of dream-like distorted vision of life. If you've ever seen kind of a wobbly mirror and looked in yourself inside of a wobbly mirror, you see everything distorted. You know, there's reality going on there, but your vision of it is all warped and distorted. And from this misty standpoint in Genesis 2, there are things about reality that are present there, but everything seems to be distorted. All of a sudden, God is not this universal divine spirit, but more of a kind of capricious man character. And this changeable God, full of good and bad, seems to create atom out of the ground. Sounds a lot like Adam. And this Adam man right away starts to fall into a slumber, falls asleep. And in his dream, he dreams that women were created to serve him. He must have been dreaming. And then his kids, his progeny, start to believe in a zero-sum contest, and they start to fight each other, because if life is made up of matter, and matter is what substance is, then we necessarily want to get more substance, more resources. And so they had to fight for it because there's a limited amount of matter. And then all hell breaks loose. And I really think the entirety of the Bible is about kind of these two visions competing, a purely spiritual conception of life. In that first chapter of Genesis, there's no death, no decay. There's just this eternal nature of everything, and everything is good. There's no introduction of disease or death or evil or the devil or some contrary force to God. And you think about it, all the anxiety or pressure we might find in life, it always comes in one way or another from the belief that there are two powers in life pushing up against each other, a good and a bad, and us versus them, a God way out there, but then a little me over here, and we're kind of at odds. Pressure, conflict, it comes from two things rubbing up against each other. If there's just one source, God, there's no pressure. There's no anxiety. It's just life expressing itself. Well, some years ago, I gained a penchant for mountaineering. And it was at a time in my life where I was really diving into these books, the Bible and science and health. And at this time in my life, I decided to go out to the Himalayas, highest mountains in the world. And when I was over there in these beautiful high mountains, I just started to have so many wonderful healing experiences. One of which was I came across a village on the Nepali-Indian border, and I met this wonderful family there. They were just the most lovely people. And yet they had a brother who just seemed to have a black cloud over his head. He was aggressively negative, and it was interesting. He just wouldn't really engage with us. I really wanted to talk to him about God. I really wanted to help lift that cloud of negativity that was over his head. He seemed to be in an echo chamber of selfishness and negative thoughts, and I really wanted to break him free from that and help him feel that love of God and experience it. And yet I never was able to, and so I went down, and I was back in the city nearby a couple days later, and I got a call from a mountaineering guide, and he said, "Hey Nate, that guy you met up in the hospital, that man who was all negative, downtrodden, he had a terrible accident, and he's in the hospital now, and people think he's going to pass on." And he asked me if I wanted to come visit him. And I said, of course. And when I got to the hospital, I did not know what I was getting into, because that hospital, it seemed like I was walking into a monster Halloween house. There was just such terrible imagery and terrible sounds of injury. And when I got to this man's room, it was especially apparent. He was strapped down to the bed, and he was acting like he was possessed by a demon. And not only that, but everyone in the room, the doctors, his family, they were sharing this story as if it was totally normal, totally natural. They thought that this is what life is. Life includes bad stuff. And in fact, some of the bad stuff in our culture is demonic possession. It happens a lot. They had seen it happen a lot. And what happened generally after somebody was demonically possessed is that they would stay this way for a couple days, and then eventually they would pass on. And for them, that was a kind of scientific truth. Science is about the patterns and regularities of nature. It's about observing nature. What does it do? And graphing that out and running experiments and seeing what are the results of those experiments. And if you asked anyone in that sick room that day, they would say, well, yeah, we've seen a lot of people with this condition, and negative things have happened after this. It usually ends in death. And so people are going to see this man. They were saying their last regards. They were leaving. And I was thinking the whole time, my gosh, this is so crazy, because I wasn't of their mental world. I didn't believe in this demonic possession. I'd only seen that at Halloween in my country. And then they were really buying into it. When I was in high school, a hypnotist came to our high school, and he hypnotized some of my friends, and they were acting in ridiculous ways. They were believing their identity was something very different. They were acting like chickens or lions or clowns. And yet when they were in this kind of intense echo chamber of belief, these false beliefs, if they were induced into believing them, and they heard the reverberation of these beliefs enough, they would start to believe and act out these false characters. Now, it seemed to me like this was an identity crisis in that hospital room there, and that this man was hypnotized. He was believing something false about himself. And in fact, it seemed like everyone was. It was contagious, this idea in their culture. It was just being shared, and then people were experiencing the ill effects of this false belief. Well, I decided to really pray about this. I made a pact in my own heart that I wasn't going to go to bed that night until I got rid of the fear and I could really sense this man as the image and likeness of God. And so that's what I did. And I went back to my hotel room and I really started to pray for this man. First, I wanted to get rid of my fear. There's an acronym for fear: false evidence appearing real. Fear is this sensation that something is wrong. But things that are wrong aren't substantial, like 2 + 2 = 5. It's not substantial. We don't want to remember that. If you're teaching a kid mathematics, you're going to tell them to forget 2 + 2 = 5 because it doesn't express the principle of mathematics. It's wrong. It should be forgotten. It's not going to help us. It's not going to help get any correct conclusions. And so I really wanted to see that image I was looking at in the hospital there, that man appearing as a demon, was absurd, false. In fact, it had no truth to it. But this man, instead, he was the actual image and likeness of God. That was always true. And as I lifted myself up in prayer that night, I started to sense that this man was one whole idea of God. If God is the divine mind, we all exist as beautiful ideas of the divine mind, analogous to every number in the number system. And sometimes you meet a new person, you've never met them before, and the same is true with numbers. I mean, you think of a random number, 1,632,000. We don't talk about that number very much. You've probably never thought about it in your life. But that number has a perfect niche. It's a perfect eternal idea. And if that number was plucked out of reality, things would go bonkers. Every banking system in the world would collapse. Absolutely needed. And the same was true about that man that night. Same is true for that man right now. He is God's expression, needed. He has a niche in reality. I like to think about it in terms of colors too. Like every color in the color wheel brings something new to the table. What is life without red? Imagine if we never got to see red. I've seen pictures of people who are colorblind and then put on glasses where they can see all the colors in life, and they just weep because life is so beautiful when you see its diversity, when you see everything having its right place. And so as I was praying for this man, I was really trying to see him as Jesus would have saw him. There's a beautiful, ubiquitous image of prayer that people have all around the world. And I think it gets to the heart of what Jesus was talking about when he said that we should pray. And the image I'm thinking of is someone down on their knees, their eyes are closed, and their hands are folded. And you go to just about anywhere in the world, and you ask a child to draw someone praying, and they'll essentially draw that symbol. Now, we don't have to be down on our knees when our eyes are closed to pray. Of course, the Bible says we should pray without ceasing. And any symbol, like going down on one's knees, or when you write something, a word is a symbol, a number, when we write it, it's a symbol. But that symbol, it's representing some very important ideas. What does it represent to be down on one's knees? I think that is about humility. What did Jesus say? I can of my own self do nothing. He really understood he wasn't self-made. He was God-made, a life-made. And if God is eternal, then he, therefore, was eternal. He said, before Abraham was, I am. He really understood eternality, what is fundamental about existence. And what about closing one's eyes? What is that about? It's about blocking out our physical perception of life as fundamental, because as we heard, that often lies to us. Like, the sun isn't rising or setting, actually, and the earth isn't flat. It's not how it seems from our limited earthly standpoint. We need to get a bigger view of things to calculate things correctly. And lastly, putting our hands together in prayer. What do you think this symbolizes? What does this connote? Often in life there seems to be this duality, good and bad, left and right, life and death, and yet when we pray there's a coming together of apparent dissolution and division, divisiveness, two-ness. There's just one, there's unity, the oneness of being. love, right? And often a pleading for it. And so as I was praying for that man, I was blocking out that limited physical perception of him, recognizing that it was totally wrong, just like it's totally wrong that the earth is flat. It just had no substance to it. And what does have substance to it? Not a personal perception of life. I was getting down on my knees mentally and really affirming that there's only one source to all of us. It's God. And I was recognizing that we are at one with God. You know, the principle of mathematics needs every one of those numbers. Every cause needs an effect. God needs us as the manifestation of God. And we don't exist without God. God doesn't exist without us. And Jesus said, be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. For something to be perfect, it needs to be eternal. It can't decay. For something to decay, it needs to be, it can't have any fundamental existence. And so I was thinking out from that perfect standpoint of perfect God, and that he was the perfect expression of God. And I started to feel these deep, numinous feelings of joy, of oneness, of wholeness, that feelings that were deeply, deeply right. Just a feeling of being at home. And all my fear just went away. I really felt like I was at home with true consciousness. I was really viewing things right. I wasn't feeling a sense of separation or fear, or isolation or division or good and bad. There was just this sense of love, of good. And that this man existed as an expression of love, of the divine good that is God. Well, what happened next was I went to visit the village where this man lived. A couple days later, I was hiking back in that region. I was going to do a longer hike. And as I was passing by his house, not only was that man back at his house already from the hospital, but he just had this numinous, just winsome smile on his face. Looked like he was on cloud nine, a totally different demeanor. And his joy just seemed so akin to that same joy I felt in my prayer that night. And his family told me how this was a miracle, but of course it wasn't a miracle as being something unusual. It was the most natural thing in the world. Not supernatural, supernatural. And that was so cool. And actually that healing seemed to kind of fuel me up, give me some inspiration to build to another healing. I was actually having grave difficulty at the high altitudes, even though I was so enamored with mountaineering at that time in my life. And I kept doing one high altitude hike after the next. Every single time when I got up to the high altitudes, I became very ill. I mean, so ill. And yet I had this book with me. I had my trusty Bible, a well-worn Bible like this one. And I had this key to the scriptures with me. And parenthetically, Jesus, I'm going to paraphrase him. He said in the book of John, essentially, I'm not going to be with you forever, but that's okay. I'm going to send you a comforter, something that will be the Spirit of truth, that will help you understand my teachings, help you apply what I'm talking about. And when Mary Baker Eddy uncovered the science of Christianity, or Christian Science, she felt it was a fulfillment to that prophetic promise, that knowledge of something would come next that Jesus had. And to say that there's a science of Christianity is just to say that there's a universal knowledge behind what Jesus did, the Christ, that truth and love of God which Jesus embodied and which he communicated. And to say that there is a Christian science is to say that it's not a mystery how Jesus healed. It wasn't a special gift. Jesus was a teacher. He was teaching others how to do what he did. And I don't think he thought of himself like, I am the one and only greatest Son of God, and everyone else is a fundamentally different material, sinful being. I think he saw each and every one of us as ideas of God, just like he was. And in fact, he thought people who followed his teachings would do the same things that he did and even greater. That's exactly what he said. And I like to think about it with my daughter. I've got a 4-year-old daughter at home, and she on a good day worships me. She thinks I can take care of all of her needs, and she comes to me to meet her needs all the time. And I can think of just imagine Jesus with his disciples. His disciples were always coming to him to meet their needs, to teach him. And to the disciples, Jesus knew so much more than they did. And they, in many ways, worshiped him. They just thought that he was so much better than they were. And yet, Jesus, I don't think he wanted those people to stay in that infantile spiritual stage forever and just kind of in that mere worship of him. In fact, I think he wanted them to grow up, to mature spiritually, to begin to see life as he did, and to begin to heal as he healed. Healing is not really changing anything about reality. It's actually just revealing the wholeness, the beauty that's always here. Just like when we lift ourselves up from a flat earth, if we went up into the heavens, you could say, in a spaceship and looked down, we wouldn't be changing a flat earth to a spheroid. We would just be seeing it from the right point of view and experiencing it from there. And what's so interesting is that so much of the difficulty in life comes from ignorance. So many times there's always a wonderful solution to be had for a particular problem, but it's just ignorance that's causing difficulty in life. When I was a kid one time, I went to write a Valentine to somebody, and I wrote the word sweetie, but I was ignorant of how to spell sweetie, and I wrote sweaty, and that caused a lot of discord when I wrote sweaty instead of sweetie. And in this book, Science and Health, it says the following. It says, "It is our ignorance of God, the divine principle, which produces apparent discord, and the right understanding of him restores harmony." In other words, the right understanding of life restores harmony, right where life might appear as discordant to our limited, myopic physical perception. Well, I want to share with you another healing account here to help concretize this idea to you. So some years ago, I had a friend who got interested in Christian Science, and he started to have some wonderful healing experiences. I tell you, he was going through a difficult breakup at the time, and in a rather uninspired moment, I said to him, why don't you just try to win her back? And I was sharing just some human advice, and he said, what I think I should actually do is read that book that you gave me, Science and Health. I think the answers are in there. And I said, yeah, don't listen to me. Go with your intuition there. And as he started to read that book, he started to look at life from a really different vantage point, a really different view of things, a spiritual view, a view out from God. In other words, instead of kind of up to a vague God that's not always seen in our experience. And from that viewpoint, he started to get a different sense of love. From a material point of view, if love is just a connection between different little individual lives, like, I'm looking for love, I need to be in the presence of this loved one. And that's how my friend felt when he was going through this difficult breakup. He was really in that consciousness, I need to be in the presence of this other person to feel love. Well, once he started to look at life out from God, he started to realize that God is love. And everything actually exists as a manifestation of love. And the beautiful thing about spirituality as opposed to materiality is that from a spiritual perspective, the more we express or give away love, the more we seem to have it. As opposed to materiality, if we lose an object of love, we've lost love. Well, my friend, he just started to give love away, just love and just give it away. And he started to feel this more capacious, oceanic sense of love all around him, that his life was a manifestation of love. And that started to lead on to more healing in his life. He quickly recovered from a car accident after some prayer, and it was such an amazing, quick recovery that it really proved to him the efficacy of Christian Science healing. Fast forward a couple more years, he called me out of the blue once, and he said, Nate, do you think we can pray about teeth? Is that something fair game? And I said, of course. And this is what he told me. He said, I had been going to the dentist for years and was told each time that I needed a root canal because my tooth was dead and discolored. The only other option was to have it pulled. And it's interesting. I think my friend, even though he was wanting to solve this particular issue, I think he wanted what you could call the ancillary effects of prayer. Prayer doesn't just heal the one thing that we're praying about. It uplifts consciousness to see everything from a higher standpoint and experience it from a higher standpoint, a higher consciousness. And it's kind of like, have you ever gone to bed in a really bad state of mind, and then all of a sudden you're inside this dream, and in the dream you see all sorts of people and all sorts of scenarios, and if the dream is being manifested by a negative consciousness, everything in your dream can seem discordant. And yet, if you fall asleep very happy, that dream can be wonderful, revelatory, beautiful experience. But either way, when you wake up, you realize what you thought was material was not material. It was all a manifestation of consciousness. And so when my friend asked me to pray about this tooth, I knew that tooth was just the image of something, an image of some conscious concept. Things have images associated with it. Every mental process has an image. Like, I'm talking to you right now, and the body is not creating thoughts for me. That's what materialism says, that the body generates, the brain generates mind and thought. Well, that's not what's going on. It's just the opposite. I'm having a thought right now, and this thought is being manifested. There's an image to it. You see a face, you see arms moving, but thought is governing this image. And this image is a partial image. You're not seeing everything that's going on within my mentality. You're seeing an image of it. And what's interesting is, according to the theory of materialism, they think the image is the thing itself. Like, there's no consciousness behind it. Like, if you were to look at a brain, there are correlations between brain activity and thought, but it's because, for the same reason that when I have a thought, my hands move. Yeah, when I have a thought, there's going to be something fire in the brain. The brain is an image of mortal thought. Well, so what seemed to be substantial to our world, most people think of matter, that's what substance is. And so they would think, well, if you have a dead tooth, what is praying about it going to change that? That seems silly. There's no correlation between the two. Well, I think everything comes from consciousness. Our experience, the images and symbols we see in life, they're all appearances, manifestations, symbols sometimes of consciousness. And so as we start to pray about my friend's tooth issue, we began with God. Mary Baker Eddy in this book, Science and Health, says to begin rightly is to end rightly. And if we want to make correct conclusions, we need to start from the source of life. Just like if we want to understand things in our galaxy, we need to start from the sun and look out from that which is illuminating everything, causing growth, warming everything up, providing everything to move in harmony in its orbit. So when we start with God, we need to recognize that God is not two things. God is not divided against itself. It's just one thing, and it's altogether good. Jesus, he used this metaphor for identity that I find very helpful. He talked about himself as the light of the world, and he talked about those who followed in his way as the light of the world also. And if you take a light beam is interesting because it just comes from one source, the sun. And if you walked up to a light beam and you started to say negative things to it, like, you've got a dead tooth, you're no good, you're decaying, you're dying, it wouldn't make any effect to that light beam. It would just keep shining brand new every moment beautifully. If you tried to put your hand up to that light beam and then you take it down, it wouldn't have stopped shining because it's brand new out from its source every moment. It's not defined by what happened to it a moment ago materially. What if you started to try to manipulate that light beam? Put some drugs into it. Try to whack it, or physically harm it. Would it affect that light beam? No. And what if you tried to box that light beam in, literally put it into a box, bring it into another room, open up that box? Would it be in there? No. Why is that? It's an interesting question, because when we think about ourselves, if we really analyze ourselves, how are we defining ourselves moment to moment? I bet it's by what people have said to us, whether it's teachers or physicians or friends. What have they said about us? What have we said in our life? What has physically occurred to us in the past? And how has the world tried to box us in, saying that we're this age, this race, from this part of town, this vocational history, put us in this little box, right? Often we think about identity in those terms. If you just ask somebody, who is this person? Most people reply, well, they're from this town, maybe they're this tall, this eye color, they went to this school and academy, and it's all these material definitions, right? And when I was praying for my friend who had that tooth issue, instead of those material definitions of his identity, we started with God, the source. Just like that light beam defined by its sun, made brand new of that sun every moment, we started to think about my friend's identity right out from God. And sometimes we think that we're going to become spiritual after a long time. Often people think we get spiritual with death. You don't get anything with death. Death is not the opposite of life. Death is our apparent absence or inability to see life. When people apparently die, if their heart stops beating, if they come back a few minutes later, they'll have a story to tell. And the story is usually, I was walking towards a light and I saw this and that, and I heard things. Sometimes they experience much more wonderful colors and a communication that is less material. They get a glimpse into a higher sense of things. But they're usually seeing, and they're usually walking. And, what eyes are they seeing with? What body are they walking in? Body and eyes, all perception, it's in consciousness. Just like when you dream at night, you're usually walking and seeing. And when you wake up, you realize that everything is in consciousness. Consciousness is not in a body. And so when a body dies, it's just it affects us no less than if a number was written in chalk and you erase that number. Well, the number is an idea. It's not in the chalk. And as I was praying for my friend with this tooth issue, we started to realize on a deep and fundamental level that death had nothing to do with him. Zero. It says in the Bible that God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to God all are alive. And this really makes sense to me because, life and death are not opposites in the same way that light and darkness are not opposites. If you walk out to a beautiful night, it's beautiful right now. If I walked out in a field and looked up at the stars, I would see vast darkness all around me with pinpricks of light. And yet, the universe is actually flooded with light everywhere. Do you know that? But our eyes are not, material eyes are often not perceptive enough to discern that light. The more we get used to being out there, the more we'll see and so forth. But when the moon shows up and it's this bright light in the sky, it's easy to recognize, oh, actually, there's no light coming from the moon. It's actually that there's just light all around where it appears dark, and the moon just shows up and it reflects that light that's there that my material eye can't discern. And so, darkness is not something. It's really an illusion, right? Imagine if there was a cave that had been dark for millions of years, and the most chronic darkness in the world, the darkest dark there is. And you said to a flashlight, come check out this darkness. It really is, the worst case of darkness there is on Earth. There's never been light there. And the flashlight shone into the cave, it would say, I don't see any darkness. I only see what my light illumines instantly. And I think Jesus, when he saw dark spaces in life, where there was sickness and death and just mental depression, I think he shone the light of God, the light of love. He was a pure transparency for God. When people met him, they felt God. And there's no physical description of Jesus in the Bible because the concept of physicality was completely eclipsed when people met Jesus, because they experienced the spirituality, the truth that just shined through him. He was just like each one of us. He was an expression of God, but he understood it more than anyone who ever lived. And so as we were praying about this tooth issue, as I was praying about it with my friend, we started to recognize, of course, that there was no death in him, just life, that his life was made brand new every moment, and that as an idea of God, that there couldn't be any decay in him. Something that this book says is that substance is eternal and incapable of decay. Well, this prayer that we're having, it was a prayer of faith. We were believing in something that we couldn't see with our physical senses. A lot of times people think of faith as blind. The Bible in Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So it is the substance we're trying to understand, we're hoping to understand. And it's evidence for something that we can't see with our material eye. Well, what's interesting is that I think real faith is based on understanding. It's not based upon just wishful thinking. And in fact, those two words, substance and understanding, are actually saying the same thing. Substance, understanding. They're about what is our foundation? What is really the root of life? What is the source and substance, the ground upon which we stand? Well, if you haven't read your Bible in a while, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, what Jesus calls the Sermon on the Mount, this higher view of things. Many scholars think it was a collected and is a collected a collection of teachings there that really give the import of Jesus' core message. And at the end of those 3 chapters there, Jesus says the following. I'm going to just read it from the Message Bible. It's this wonderful little passage here about foundation. He essentially says if you build your life on the rock, it's if you build your house, your consciousness, you could say, on the rock, on the solid truth of what he was teaching, it's not going to come down when the storms of life knock at our door. He says, these words I speak to you are not incidental additions to your life, homeowner improvements to your standard of living. They're foundational words, words to build a life on. If you work these words into your life, you are like a smart carpenter who built his house on solid rock. Rain poured down, the river flooded, or tornado hit, but nothing moved that house. It was fixed to the rock. Well, we were building mentally in our prayer from this standpoint that God is eternal. Then therefore, my friend's substance is in eternal fundamental ideas that flow from God, that there could be nothing destructive or causing conflict within him, that he was this whole perfect idea of God, unified. Health, it comes from the same etymology as the word wholeness and holiness does. And I think real health is a sense of wholeness, of holiness, understanding life from that unity of being that comes from an understanding of God. And that's what we felt that night as we prayed. And again, deep feelings, sensations of rightness, like what you could call a spiritual sense of life. That's what we had that night. So to conclude that healing story, my friend later wrote the following. He said, the day after we spoke and prayed about it, I went into the dentist, and he and all the nurses were baffled. They looked at the x-ray from before, the ones taken that day. And they looked into my mouth. They said that tooth looked perfectly healthy and I was fine. Nothing further was needed. They said they had never seen anything like it before in all their years of dentistry. Well, how cool is that? And that wasn't supernatural, wasn't unusual. In fact, it was the most natural thing in the world. Supernatural. Often in life, we think of science as those patterns and regularities of nature that seem so constant, like gravity, or and yet something can seem very constant, but if it's not viewed from the correct standpoint, it's not correct. We often make approximations in life that are suitable for just a little myopic view of existence. It's easy to think that life is material when we're just trying to go about our everyday experience and make a little difference. Just like it's easy to think about if the earth is flat if I'm just going to walk across the room. It's a lazy approximation, and it works if I'm just traveling short distances, right? But if I'm going to fly in a plane halfway across the country or halfway across the world, I'm going to hope that the pilot has calculated in his GPS, he's calculated out from that standpoint that the Earth is a sphere. If not, we're going to head off into outer space or into some lake. We're not going to get where we need to get going. We're not going to get to the right place because we're not calculating from a right premise. And when we want to make a big difference in life, when we want to see healing in life, when we want to see big change in life, we need to calculate out from this higher standpoint where wholeness and eternal beauty lies. Well, when I started to read the writings of Mary Baker Eddy when I was in college, I really diving into this book, I started to read some biographies of her as well. This one is a wonderful book. There's a new edition of it called Christian Healer. And this amplified edition shares over 300 healings that came about through her life experience. And it was recorded that she healed people who are blind and crippled, and healed people who had had cancer in its last stages. And one of the things that I love reading in this book is how when people met her, it just seemed to change their life. They often experienced things that they never thought were possible. In fact, before I tuned into this lecture, I was reading this account of a man who had what this book says, an unreasoning and an unprovoked hatred for Mrs. Eddy that amounted to insanity. And when he was on vacation, he decided to go kind of look upon this object of his cruel obsession. And when he went to meet Mary Baker Eddy, he said he felt a flood of divine love such as he never dreamt existed on this earth. And he was healed of an ailment that he had. And so many people who met her felt a kind of love that they thought was not possible in our present experience. They really felt heaven on earth. Jesus asked us to pray for heaven on earth. Heaven being, our ideal of life, the concept, the pure concept of God, and earth, our present experience. And we want to bring these things together, have them be one, but sometimes that seems difficult. And throughout the history of religion throughout the ages, there have been many people, many mystics, many charismatic individuals who started their own religions, who seem to know something about what you could call the perfection that underlies reality, something about love, something about the unity of being. And they often had a wonderful healing effect on others. Been many people like that. But so many people have fallen into the trap of just beginning to worship that individual, and get addicted to them. I saw a documentary on Netflix not too long ago where there was a particular guru who had such an effect on people. And people wanted to get close to him so bad that they even started breaking the law and doing terrible things to get at the feet of this man. Well, Mary Baker Eddy really understood that sense of individual little lives and some little lives over there worshiping a life over here, that is just totally wrong. That is the opposite of what Christian Science presents, of looking at God out, looking at life out from God's point of view and seeing each of one of us as beautiful, needed ideas of life, all valued, all loved. And Mary Baker Eddy, she had just the opposite effect on people. She didn't promote personality worship. In fact, she talked about how important it is to heal our sense of personality worship and how important it is to get inspired to become healers ourselves, not just going to someone else to do the work. And what is so interesting is that so many people who met Mary Baker Eddy walked away feeling inspired that, wow, I can do this too, instead of feeling like, oh, I'm going to get into a bad addictive relationship with some charismatic person. A wonderful example of this is that there was a woman named Harriet O'Brien from Kansas City in America. And this woman, Harriet O'Brien, she really had a difficult life. She seemed to pick up one difficult ailment after the next, had chronic spine issues, chronic heart issues. She became so ill, she stopped speaking normally. Her body started to break down. She stopped writing, stopped talking. And when she was at death's throes, as she put it, she was introduced to Christian Science. And quickly she started to recover. She started to have a Christian Science practitioner pray for her. And quickly she started to revive. And it was amazing. And she started to get better so fast. She started to think, all things are possible to God. Maybe I can even walk again. She had picked up along the way what's called an iatrogenic ailment, something caused by medical error. One of her ligaments was severed by accident in a surgery, and she was relegated to a wheelchair. But as she prayed about this more and more, eventually she was able to get up out of that wheelchair and walk normally. After that, you could imagine she wanted to meet Mary Baker Eddy. She had this deep desire to meet the woman who discovered Christian Science and wrote this wonderful book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And she went to meet Mary Baker Eddy, and this is what she said of that experience. She said, "Transparency is the word that best expresses my impression of Mrs. Eddy. Instinctively, I felt her great love, and I was conscious that no one I had ever seen loved me as much as she did. My entire thought was filled with a spiritual illumination, and there was a glory in the sunshine and landscape, as though a breath of heaven had swept earth and enveloped me." Oh, do I like that. And yet, this woman, Harriet O'Brien, wasn't just knocking at Mary Baker Eddy's door the next day thinking, oh, I want to get another dose of that heavenly experience. No, she said she had a question in her heart when she met Mary Baker Eddy that day, just briefly. And the question was, can I be a healer too? Can I help others in the way that I was helped? That was her desire. And she noted that the moment she met Mary Baker Eddy, that question, without words even being exchanged, was answered in her heart. And she hopped on a train, went back to her home in Kansas City, and quickly started a public practice of Christian Science healing. She advertised in a journal that's still ongoing today, the Christian Science Journal, for over 50 years as a public practitioner of Christian Science, and she left a long record of healing. She said on several occasions she helped raise people from their apparent deathbed and helped raise them to a life of health and prosperity. So I just love that. And Christian Science, it really does help everyone learn how to heal, because healing is not actually changing anything. It's just learning to see the wholeness and health that are naturally a part of life. And as we do that, it's natural for that health to appear. Sometimes can appear so quick that it's impossible from a material standpoint, but it's the most natural thing in the world to see and experience what's true. Jesus, he said, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free, or shall set you free. And the truth that Jesus shares in the Bible is often perplexing to people. One of the key things is when you read the Bible, Jesus, even his disciples really didn't understand what he was talking about so much of the time, because he was seeing life spiritually. When he used words like food, he was always just talking about what's the spiritual substance of these words, because he saw life imbued with deep meaning. And so when he said, if you want to follow me, you need to drink my blood and eat my body, he wasn't talking about cannibalism, obviously. He was using words like body and blood to represent what's important about life, because that's what we think is important about life, is the kind of a physical body. But he saw things very differently. And people, when they look at Jesus' life, they often just read it on the surface. And they're often not seeing it from the right standpoint. So when often you see people talk about Jesus, they often have the cross as the symbol for his life. And that cross does do a lot for us emotionally. And it is a wonderful symbol in that it shows us all that Jesus did for us. Jesus did die for us in the sense that he went to the cross not to get a better house for himself, but he was doing something there to help all of us. And yet the cross is an incomplete symbol for his life, because there were two other people on crosses that day, and when Jesus died, that wasn't the end of the story. In fact, when Jesus died, his disciples went back to fishing. They gave up. They thought, oh my gosh, Jesus, our great teacher, when we were with him, we felt life and life more abundantly. We felt like the kingdom of heaven was right here with us. We saw the most amazing healings. But look, death won. Death took him. Death has the final word. And death seems so influential to them. This opposition to life. The Bible talks about death as the last enemy. It seems so influential that they just went back to their old jobs. They gave up on the spirituality stuff. But then when Jesus started to show up to everybody, as he said he would, that's what changed all of human history. Everything about Jesus' teachings is about eternality. It's about that which is fundamental, that which cannot decay or die. And he approved that with his resurrection. And what Jesus was teaching was about the allness of life, that even our view of what death is cannot take life away. Life is fundamental. When a sun sets, it's not dead, it's not gone. When people's life seems to set, it's not gone. Jesus, I think, really understood everyone as fundamental, eternal ideas. Jesus once said something very wonderful. He said, that's not it. This is Jesus. He said, greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And it's so interesting. Jesus, he talked about, if we're going to seek our life and try to gain it, we're going to lose it. But if we lose our life, we're going to gain it. And so much of his teachings from a material point of view literally don't make any sense at all. But when you see them spiritually, you totally understand. When he was laying down his own desires, his own kind of selfish feelings of life preservation and so forth, he wasn't losing anything. When he was losing a sense of a material selfhood, he was actually gaining everything. And Mary Baker Eddy, in her writings, so often she says things like, seek your own and another's good. And when we love without self, when we look at each other, not from a standpoint of what am I going to get out of this, but to really see the spiritual identity of other people, that's when we can really gain the good of life. And that's when we gain who we really are, because we've always been spiritual expressions of God. Well, I want to share with you one last example of this, and then I'll open it up to some Q&A here. So if you have any questions, write it in the YouTube chat or write it on the Guilford webpage there. So some years ago, I went to a dark place in the world. I went to a prison near where I lived in Boston, and I wanted to share what I was learning about in Christian Science. And this prison, it was just kind of an everyday place, and yet it seemed kind of dark and scary when I first went in there. And there was a lot of people who were just kind of in a figurative and literal box, and there were many systemic issues you could see in our culture that caused people to be locked up there. And I met one young man who seemed like a really good guy, but he just was born into a scenario where the world just seemed to box him in. And he really believed in that material box. In fact, he especially believed that he was defined by his father. He said, my father's a criminal, grandfather's a criminal. I think it's just in my blood. He thought it was just in his body. It was just in this box that he was given. And I said to him, do you know what the Bible says about fathers? It says, call no man on earth your father, for there is one, and which is one in heaven. And it's so interesting. I was healed of that blood condition that I was dealing with when I was up in the high altitudes in the Himalayas, doing a lot of hikes out there. After I fully identified myself as a spiritual expression of God, understood more about that, I was actually able to do high altitude hikes without any ill effects. And that was just really awesome. And I shared that with him, but even more importantly, I shared that analogy of the light beam. And if God is like the sun, we are like a ray of light or a beam of light. That beam of light is defined, everything in it is defined by its source. It's given to it by its source, not by its material surroundings, not by what people have said about it, not by what's happened in its physical past, not by how the world has tried to box it in, this age, this race, from this part of town, and so forth. And I started to share these kind of ideas with this young man who was at one of these services that I was giving there. And you could see this young man, he was just hungering and thirsting for what is right. And this view of life just really started to alter his perspective. I started to unpack what it means to see yourself as an expression of God to him. If God is loving, if God is love, then he is loving. That's his very nature. If he tries to hate someone, he's going to feel bad. It's going to feel wrong because it's literally wrong. God is soul, so he's beautiful. He's creative. He's wholesome. God is truth. He's an honest man, a good man. God is life itself, and he's vivacious. He's full of life, ever new. And God is principle, and therefore order and discipline, everything right place, the right time within him. As we explored those synonyms together, you could see this man, his thought was just beginning to move in healthy directions. And it felt like that prodigal son parable in the book of Luke, where there's this man comes home to the father. And prior to that, he looked away from God and wasted his life in what the King James Bible tactfully calls riotous living. He was looking at life in matter, in pleasure, in a material box, in a limited way. And so, anyhow, this individual, he went back to his cell. He started reading this key to the scriptures, Science and Health, along with a little Bible. And he started to get a new view of himself. Fast forward about 6-7 weeks later, he comes back to this area of the prison. And this time there's a big crowd. He must have invited his buddies. And he's just sitting in the back with this beautiful smile on his face. It reminded me of that man who had been healed of that demon up in the Himalayas there. Just a completely different demeanor, just so full of just childlike joy. Jesus said to enter the kingdom, we need to become like little children, just so open, receptive, Often in life, we're closed up in our own little echo chambers, like trying to gain our own information. And yet, life is a gift. Prayer, in so many ways, is really opening our arms to God, to life, receiving anew. Prayer is listening. It's listening to this divine guidance. We aren't creators. We actually don't create thought. When you're quiet, you realize thought is just coming. It's either a thought for God, from God, or it's a kind of a distortion. It's a kind of a thought from God, filtered through cultural beliefs that might show up in a very distorted way in our life. But there's really only one source to things. It's God. And so prayer is listening to God. And this man, he did listen to God. He started to define himself right, and he started to hear these little messages about himself from God. He started to feel deeply loved, deeply whole, deeply complete at one. And he walked up to me after that service, nice and slow, and said, "Hey, Nate, I got a testimony for you." And he told me how when he came into that jail, he had been diagnosed with lung cancer. And he heard over the intercom those weeks ago that I was going to share a healing service. And that's why he came. He was looking for healing. And those ideas sure helped him. And his symptoms after that service quickly vanished. And his buddies were saying, "Oh, it's probably a relapse." And he waited, never returned. And that day he stood in front of me as this paragon of health, this shining example of what it means to be a child of God. He was shining with all those qualities that come out of Matthew 5, that first chapter in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about the qualities in which we are blessed, in which we can really experience the fullness of life. And those qualities are meekness and humility and striving for righteousness and being a peacemaker and being poor in spirit, really knowing our need of God, and so forth. And he was just shining with that and just so open, so childlike. And it was a beautiful thing to behold. He got quiet at that point and he said, "Now, Nate, do you think this could help me in other areas of my life?" Of course it can. Christian Science, everything I've been talking about today, when we internalize this, it begins to touch every aspect of our life. Consciousness is unitary, and when we lift our thought to a higher perspective, we can begin to see and experience everything from that higher point of view. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. I see a few have come in already. Let's see what we got. Okay, so someone asked, "I am a caretaker to my elderly dad who has been diagnosed with multiple conditions. The question is, how can I maintain a right mindset regarding health and care for his needs at the bodily level?" Well, it's you don't need to look at the bodily level. To love is to do something that's practical. If you met someone on the street and they said, "I am love itself, but I'm not going to show you," that wouldn't be very loving. To be loving, it's necessarily to be practical, to be effective. For something to be love, it needs to be felt and experienced. What is tangible and concrete in our life is not bodily or physical. It's something that is felt and experienced, and that by necessity has to be within consciousness. And when we think about caring for others, it's always a sense of how can we make them feel the most loved and cared for. God is love, so for them to feel God, feel truth, it's to feel love. And there's a little line that I love in Science and Health where it says, "The poor suffering heart needs its rightful nutriment, such as peace, patience in tribulation, and a priceless sense of the dear Father's loving kindness." And that's on page 365 in Science and Health. And in fact, that phrase is a part of a chapter called Christian Science Practice in Science and Health that has a lot to say about how we can practically help people who seem to have needs. And I just want to say, whoever wrote that question, I bet you're doing a great job. Your love is shining right in that situation. And I think what's good and what's helpful is to take time in prayer for yourself, to pray for yourself, to know that you're an expression of God. So much healing, it starts from us, understanding who we are. It's easy to get wrapped up in images of others and so forth and get caught up in drama if we don't first know who we are. Jesus focused so much on his identity. And I think that's actually an example for us, that we need to understand who we are as expressions of God. And as we do that, we can naturally do what we do. There's an analogy I love. I've been talking about the sun and the light beam and so forth. And, if God is like the sun and we are like a light beam that shines out from a sun, when those light beams shine out and hit something, like the earth, what does it naturally do to the earth? It illumines, it shows all the colors there. Those light beams naturally warm up the situation there on earth, provide opportunities for growth, because that light and everything in that light provides growth naturally. And if those light beams said, no, I'm not going to shine today, I'm not going to shine out from my source brand new every moment, well, there would be no color on earth, no growth on earth. No beauty on earth. But those light beams have a kismet, they have a destiny, they have a reason for existing. And it's to be the light of the world. And right when you seem to be in a difficult situation, perhaps caring for someone who's difficult to be cared for, it's important to understand that you are the light of the world. And every quality of God is in you, just like every color of light is in every beam of light from the sun. If you put a prism up to any light beam coming out from the sun, you would see that every color is included in that light. And, Mary Baker Eddy once wrote that humility is the lens and prism of mind healing. We have to be very humble in situations like this to really pray for ourselves and realize all the beautiful colors of our own identity and to see ourselves as the light of the world. But as we do that, we can naturally see that we're not designed to propagate any personal opinion or feel the conflict of one mind versus another mind, but we're here just to naturally express God in a way that's effortless, that's good, that's moved by God. Jesus, often before he healed someone, said, I was moved with compassion. So you don't have to figure out what's right on your own. You can just pray, listen to God, rightly identify yourself, and God will move you to do the right thing, to care for this loved one in the right way. Okay, someone says, what page in Christian Healer about the man who hated Mrs. Eddy? That is page 370 if you have this book, Christian Healer, that incident I mentioned on there. Someone said, what is the process for healing prayer? Is it silent? Are there words spoken? If you could express the light that comes from God within, does it flood through or is it sourced from the heart? That's a great question. Sometimes when people ask, what words do you say in prayer? Jesus gave an example prayer, the Lord's Prayer, right? There's a lot to learn about that example. It, of course, starts with God and God's nature, and then it flows to our actions, to forgiveness, and to praying not to be tempted and so forth. And then it ends with this sense of glory and gratitude. And that's a helpful kind of way to think about prayer. It's a little outline for a helpful prayer. But prayer is something that goes on without ceasing. It's something we always do. It's the right perspective of life. And, Mary Baker Eddy talked about prayer like keeping your violin in tune. I'm a musician myself, and if you become a good musician, you can really hear when a note is perfectly in tune or not, and even when there's very subtle things that are out of tune. And prayer is aligning our thought to God, and the more we do that, the more we realize, even if it's slightly off, how to bring us back on track. And to bring our thought back in line with God, there's so many ways to do it. It takes a deep desire to love, to be good, to see things in the right way. Sometimes it takes argumentation. Like if you are convicted of a crime and you are innocent, you're not set free by the judge by just saying, I didn't do it. You have to argue your case. You have to know the reason why and plead the case. And that prayer often takes the form of that. So, when you read Science and Health, it talks about ways to know truth that counter different claims of limited or material or erroneous viewpoints. It shows you how to argue your case. And what I find so helpful is to think about prayer in terms of a relationship. Jesus talked about God in terms of Abba or Daddy, kind of a father-son relationship. And what makes a good relationship is faith, understanding, and love, I think. When you have an absolute faith in someone, you really believe in them, that's going to afford a good relationship. If you really understand who they are, that's going to take quality time. It's going to take patience. It's going to take a sense of non-judgmental listening. And a good relationship takes love. But there are no perfect words that make a great relationship. You can't just say, I love you, and a great relationship is made. No, it's something ongoing that takes qualities of thought. And those qualities are going to manifest in the right way. They're going to manifest in words that matter. But there are no pre-subscribed words that make for a great relationship, just like there are no pre-subscribed words that make for a right prayer. And so prayer, it starts in the heart with the right desire. It starts from seeking things from the right standpoint. But then it does take shape, often in words and in deeds. So let's see what else came in. Someone was asking a question, and I got this through email here, about, let's see if I can pull this up, about demons. They were saying, why were there so many demons in Israel if they were supposed to be the group chosen by God? And so they're probably asking this in reference to that story of the demonic possession that I shared. That probably stirred some thought there. Well, if you think of it, people in Jesus' day in Israel thought that they were the chosen people. I don't think Jesus saw it quite that way, in that he saw that truth applied to everyone. And he went outside the box of Judaism. Jews really didn't like Samaritans. They thought that they were essentially believing in the wrong religion. They had the wrong sense of God, the wrong sense of what's right. And Jesus, through parable, shared a parable of the Good Samaritan, and he talked to a Samaritan woman sharing a deep teaching with him. These things are cataloged in the New Testament. And I don't think Jesus saw the Jews as chosen people. I think he saw everyone as ideas of God. And onto the demon part of that question, I don't think I think of demons as temptations. When Jesus was in the wilderness, he was tempted by the devil. And when people experience demonic possession or hypnotism, these are different forms of challenges. And you wouldn't say that the most successful people have the least amount of challenges, or the best group of people should have the least amount of challenges. No, I think often people who are doing good work are confronted with more and more difficult challenges in life. And those challenges are often proof of God's care. They're necessary events to prod on progress and growth. And so even though evil has no place in God's kingdom, challenges certainly do. If you're a loving parent, you would never not challenge your kids to something, right? You would want to present challenges for their growth, but you would never want to do anything evil to them. So there's a way of seeing life where we can understand that challenges are a natural part of life, but evil is absolutely unacceptable. And inadmissible. So to just close up this lecture here, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. Everything I've been sharing really rests upon this line in Science and Health. It's the very first line. It says, "The prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick is an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of Him, and unselfed love." And everything I've been sharing today, it's about reforming sin within us. Sin is really just a false belief. It's being off the mark. It's bringing out the saint in all of us. And it's giving us a sense of what real health actually is as the consciousness of God. And the way we get that is not through some kind of blind faith. It's through an absolute faith. I was learning how to float years ago in Hawaii, and I realized how there was a lot of lessons about floating that are analogous to faith. And one of the things with floating is to become a good floater, you need to completely lean on the water, 100%. You can't just be 90% in. You need to go all in. And to have an absolute faith in God is to recognize that God really is the foundation of everything, this eternal life that we're all in and of, and to begin to completely lean on that. Get off your own 2 feet mentally and lean on that divine, infinite life and love. And in fact, the very first line of this book in the preface says, "To those leaning on the sustaining infinite, today is big with blessings." And so, as we find ourselves with more and more of that absolute faith in life, as we understand the true nature of life, and we begin to express the love that is true life, we're going to see healing as not an unusual activity, but out from that standpoint, it's the most natural thing in the world, and we can all do it. So I want to shout out to the First Church of Christ Scientist in Guilford, Connecticut. A big thank you to them for sponsoring this lecture. I hope you can jump on christianscience.com or JSH, christianscience.com to learn more about Christian Science. Maybe check out the Christian Science Journal, Sentinel, Herald, these magazines that are going on around the world. People are writing for them around the world, all about their experiences in Christian Science. And you can check out, find a practitioner to work with. You could find a reading room near you, a church near you to attend. You can find out about more lecture events like this going on around the world. So to conclude, I'd just like to say that each and every one of you are a beautiful spiritual idea of God. And I think each of you have a beautiful niche that doesn't compromise anyone else's niche in life. And I hope you caught a glimpse of that today. I hope you caught a glimpse of your spiritual identity. You are the light of the world. Thank you so much.